The growing calls across the nation to defund the police. But what does that mean? What could it look like? And will it make our communities safer?
What we are seeing across the country is violence surging.
Every day when I turn on the news or go on social media, I see stories about protesters rioting in the streets over issues like systemic racism, oppression, and police brutality. But at the same time, stories about gang violence affecting Black and minority communities across America receive little to no media attention. As I began digging into what's happening in these cities, a tragic and shocking pattern emerged about who the real victims often are: children.
We've learned a 12-year-old boy has been shot and killed.
A 12-year-old was shot and killed on the south side.
Police saying a 13-year-old in critical condition.
As I uncovered more and more stories of young children being indiscriminately murdered, I wanted to find out why these tragedies are so underreported and speak with people who are fighting back.
We have really politicized the criminal justice system in general. We've tried to make it an issue of social justice rather than an issue of implementation and enforcement of the law. Over 600 innocent young children have been murdered in the inner cities of our country since 2020.
It's not unique to New York or Chicago or LA. You're seeing it on a national level. Almost every time that there is something that catches the news, that produces some kind of policy that's often in the direction that's more favorable to the criminal element and less favorable to the victims and the law enforcement officers charged with keeping cities safe.
It's just senseless. I think people come numb to it because it happens. Everywhere you go, it's the same thing. Murderers and just getting off. Jail is packed, so they letting people out.
When my son was murdered, I thought there would be outrage and that justice was going to be swift, but I realized, like, there's no outrage. I'm going to have to be that outrage. I'm going to have to be the voice for my baby because no one here knows. No one even knows that a 4-year-old was murdered because there's a lot of people murdered. Like, get in line. It's almost the tone of it here. Through that, I realized a lot of children have been murdered, and I had no idea. My name is Happy Gregg. I'm the mother of Michael Moultrie Jr. We call him MJ, and I wanted to take the time to tell the story about what happened to my son and the other children in the city of Chicago that have been murdered here. These are the last images that I took of my son. This is MJ on his way to Chicago that day to come visit his father. And within 24 hours, this is what he looked like.
Michael Moultrie Jr., or MJ for short, was only 4 years old when his life was taken. He was just one of 8 children killed across Chicago that same weekend.
More than 2,000 people have been shot this year in the Windy City.
Some say that it was a war between the blocks in this neighborhood, that it had been some retaliation shootings going on a month before me and my son arrived here. MJ was sitting here as he was getting his hair done, and his father was sitting there. And then you can still see some of the bullet holes, like right there, and then still up there too.
Wow. Were they ever able to catch who did this?
No. And there's not a single suspect in custody for it. Through talking to people, knocking on doors, we got some really good intel from some people, in the streets, in the neighborhood. We were able to identify who these suspects were. The information checked out, everything lined up perfectly as to say, like, these are the people who did the shooting. However, the state's attorney's office gives the police department a list of things that they have to check off before they can bring charges and arrest someone. So from the police's standpoint, although the information was good information, they have the circumstantial evidence, but the people who gave me the information, they're just not willing to go into open court to identify these kids. So because of that, they get to be as free as a bird. Wow. My son still has no justice.
I was born into a broken home. I was raised in foster care until I was 10 years old. By the time I was 10, I was a gang member, a juvenile delinquent, and a truant. I was a child of the streets. And at the age of 10, my father took me out of foster care, gave me an entirely new sense of direction. I went on to graduate from Harvard Law School, founded several churches, and of course established the Forgotten Children Project, chronicling the deaths of these children. I realized when the whole movement began to dismantle the police and defund the police, that it was going to lead to some problems in the community that is most beset by crime, which is the inner city, the Black community. I didn't know that it was going to affect children the way it has. And we've had an average of about 10 children dying every month from street violence. You talk to Happy Gregg. She said to me something I will never forget. And she would ask the police, well, when you catch one of these guys who's killed a 5-year-old, 6-year-old child, and you tell them that that was the result, what's the reaction? They say, collateral damage.
You know, people should feel something. When you take the life of the innocent, you should feel something. I was like, you know, maybe if I appeal to the murderers, let them know, like, I know you didn't mean to shoot my son. He was 4. Like, I know he wasn't the target, but you should come forward. And they don't care. I knew then that although it was unfair, that I was gonna have to fight a different type of battle here.
The root of the problem is the same problem I had. If you've got young people growing up in dysfunctional homes, what do these kids look to for vision of what their lives can be? For example, as soon as a young boy is old enough and he starts listening to his friends, they become his primary source of influence. And if they're out there telling him being a man means you need to get a gun, and if somebody disrespects you, you need to go shoot that person, and you need to join us, we're dealing drugs. And this is what it really means to take care of yourself. And he gets this skewed vision of life, but it becomes normal for him.
What do you think the incentive is for these young teenagers, even at times, joining gangs? Like, what is so appealing about it when they see how much pain it's causing in the city?
When you're receiving $10,000 at 18 years old for a murder, I mean, that's a lot more incentivizing than going down to the factory or going down to your local McDonald's and earning a paycheck. I mean, it's more fruitful. It's more incentivizing to make that easy money versus going and clocking in for work.
What can't be denied are the impacts of bad policy. On top of the defund the police initiatives, DAs in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles have incentivized crime by reducing penalties, jail time, and cash bail, eliminating 3 strikes, and refusing to even prosecute certain offenses. To learn more about this, I sat with Rafael Mangual, who has been researching criminal justice reform, progressive DAs, and depolicing for over a decade.
The election of progressive prosecutors across the country is a really rapidly growing phenomenon. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, the word progressive prosecutor wouldn't have meant anything to anyone. And now, something like 70 million Americans live in jurisdictions with progressive prosecutors. So what makes a progressive prosecutor? Well, these are people who have whole lists of crimes that they will refuse to prosecute. They restrict what their line prosecutors can do in the way of requesting pretrial detention, in the way of using sentencing enhancements. They cap sentences, right? I mean, Alvin Bragg in New York City says that you have to get his permission to sentence someone to more than 20 years. You know, the list goes on and on and on, but almost every reform that has been enacted over the last decade, and there have been a lot of them, have been in one direction. And that direction is making crime less costly to commit and making the law more costly to enforce.
How do you think that these soft on crime policies are affecting the general population in layman's terms?
You know, they're sending an important message, which is that we don't believe that enforcement is the right way to approach crime. In order for justice to be reintroduced into the system, it has to be more lenient. Part of the progressive ideology requires you to subscribe to the belief that crime is not the fault of the perpetrator.
We begin with staggering numbers after an incredibly violent holiday weekend in Chicago.
Dave, police are still looking for leads after 7-year-old Natalia Wallace was shot in the forehead.
On the 4th of July of 2020, Nathan Wallace was returning from the grocery store when his life changed forever. His 7-year-old daughter, Natalie, had been playing with her siblings outside of her grandmother's house when gang members sprayed the streets with bullets. Natalie was struck in the head and rushed to the hospital, where she was later pronounced dead.
She was playing by the tree. So, she liked to sing. Like the Frozen song, see him watch the movie and sung it so many times. I think I know the words. It's just the innocence in her, I guess, you know. The last thing I can remember now that kind of haunts me a little bit is one time she asked to see a movie before the incident that happened. And I was so tired from work, and I'm like, baby, we got time, you know, and we didn't have time.
It hurts me that my youngest daughter is no longer here, 7 years old. That I would not be able to talk to her, hold her, tell her anything, her bedtime stories, anything. Y'all robbed me of that.
It's the third consecutive weekend in Chicago where children have been shot and killed.
It gotta stop. It gotta stop. What the hell are we thinking? If Black lives don't matter to us, how in the hell is it supposed to matter to anybody else?
At the time of Natalie's death, I was a Black Lives Matter activist.
Say his name! Say his name!
I was initially drawn to BLM because the media convinced me that thousands of Black people were being shot and killed by racist white police officers. But it didn't make sense to me why Black rioters would loot and destroy their own communities in the name of racial justice. Whenever I'd raise a question about if all cops were actually racist or where all the BLM money was going, I was called a traitor and told to stay in line. When I stopped supporting Black Lives Matter, I was asked if I no longer supported Black lives. The reality is every murder is a terrible tragedy, regardless of the skin color of the perpetrator. That meant caring as much about children being caught in the crossfire of gang violence. It also meant listening more carefully to BLM's leaders when they told the world who they really are.
We are super versed on ideological theories. We are trained Marxists.
Is what sells. Activism is what drives the narrative. And, that's not really rooted in anything. It's rooted in emotion. It's rooted in rhetoric. But the data tell a very, very different story.
The sad reality is 52% of the murders that happen in America are committed by young Black men. And they're killing mainly each other. 72% of Black children are born out of wedlock. 66% of Black children are never raised in a two-parent monogamous family. And it's based upon government policy, which disincentivized marriage, encourage men to leave the home so that women could collect more money from these programs. And it just set up a slippery slope that has ended up in all kinds of problems. And we're seeing, if you don't address it, it ultimately spills out. And it affects everything and everybody. And we've got to see it as a problem that is really common to us all as Americans and as human beings, that we want people to be able to live in safety.
Yes, there is a crime problem with this progressive prosecutor movement, but saying that does not mean that policing is broken, that it needs to be overhauled or reimagined or whatever the word of the day is. We have to look at the people who are stuck in these places where crime is a real problem. And if you ask them what they don't want less policing. They don't want less harsh punishments for people who really break the law. Do they want fairer policing? Of course. But we have to have a more nuanced, more balanced, and calmer conversation that allows us to get to a point where we don't make policy as kind of a knee-jerk reaction to a viral incident, because no one's helped by that.
So for the people who can't move out, they're just stuck for whatever reason, is there any advice that you can give them just to, again, protect their family from crime?
Make their voices heard. Talk to your elected officials. Get involved in some of these races. Get out and vote. Understand that the system's going to keep going unless you stop it.
They've got to start hearing from the people, because here again, the people most victimized by this tend to be the Black folks, inner city people, poor people living in these communities. We've got to rebuild families if we're going to see the next generation have a better life than they're having right now.
It starts at home. Because if you was being raised right, you ain't gonna be out there doing, nonsense.
You have two options. Like when you have to bury your child, you either wither away into nothing, you just let the grief overwhelm you, or you fight. So I chose advocacy. I just chose to fight. And through that is the nonprofit work that I do. I connected with a lot of families who had lost their children just over the decades. We got a law passed in MJ's name to help with their funeral and burial expenses. And then we also just help them get awareness, because we know it's not easy to get awareness, because if you don't advocate for your child, they will just be lost in the shuffle of, unfortunately, the other murdered children. So we just help them get their story out the way that we've been able to do with MJ.
If there was anything that you could tell MJ right now, what would you tell him?
I will tell him that I'm sorry. I want to tell him that I'm sorry, and that I wish I was there to protect him, to hold him, to shield him, to comfort him in the pain he must have felt, and how scared he must have been. I will just tell him I'm sorry for what happened to him.
What kind of country are we living in where children are murdered in our major cities almost every day? This has to stop. So what can we do? We can demand more of our local politicians, especially our district attorneys. They must focus their full attention on putting criminals behind bars, not letting them back on the street. We also need to demand more of ourselves. No more celebrating the cultural rot. It degrades our society and leads us nowhere. It is literally a dead end. Mainstream media cynically highlights stories that promote their agenda. They've made household names of George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, and Michael Brown. So it's on us to highlight truly innocent victims like MJ, Natalie, and thousands of others like them, because their lives mattered.